afternoon, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm sure you've all got some burning questions to ask. I might just kick things off by asking, going into the...
Don't breathe out too much. Sorry.
Feel relaxed, it's fine. Going into the digital platforms inquiry, were you expecting to uncover the kind of depth of concern and issues that you did?
No, I don't think so. I don't think we... Well, I mean, probably different experiences of people in the team. I certainly don't think I expected to see the amount of data collection in so many ways. I certainly had no idea of the way the advertising technology market worked. That was really an amazing revelation. So just the breadth of data, I hadn't really expected.
And I should add, if any of you have as a question, just please put your hand up and we'll just ask you to announce yourself, where you work, and then ask the question and do your best to make it a question rather than a statement if you're able to. Continuing on, as your report concluded with 23 recommendations, which, as you mentioned in your speech earlier, is now the subject of vigorous lobbying to perhaps change or remove. Now, it seems you've got great ambitions to deal with the issues that you've dealt with in the digital platform inquiry, but the platforms you're dealing with are large global organisations. How do you think you will go and Australian Parliament will go in trying to regulate the activities of large platforms like that?
A couple of things. Firstly, the recommendations gave roles to, yes, the ACCC, but also the Privacy Commissioner, greatly improving the laws the Privacy Commissioner works with, the Australian Competition and Media Authority, ACMA. So there's roles for a lot of people. The 23 recommendations are all implementable by the Australian government. There's no doubt Google and Facebook are doing business in Australia, so they're caught by our competition and consumer laws, but they're also, of course, caught by laws generally. So all the 23 recommendations can be implemented, and ultimately, if the government were to implement them, then Google and Facebook's only choice is not to be in Australia. And I don't think they'll make that choice, even though in the past, when other governments have threatened them with things, they have threatened to leave the country. I don't think they'll do that here, partly because some of the things they did threaten to leave the country on in other countries were of a different ilk to what we've recommended. But also, there's just momentum gathering around the world, so not much point backing up against what we're recommending because it could well happen elsewhere. So I think it all can be done, and we're hopeful the government will. But in addition, we're working with overseas regulators. Now, in our case, we're working mainly with our fellow competition regulators who we're talking to a lot. So there's a lot of coordinated action going in various ways.
And to some degree, you were saying earlier that there's a combination of existing laws, but the need to reform laws to deal with the new changes. To what extent, in your dialogue or working with international agencies, are you also involved in kind of advocating that the way that you've proposed forward is the way to go for the rest of the world?
Look, good question. Certainly, I mean, it depends on the issue. So with privacy, Europe, of course, for those who are involved in privacy, has already introduced a massive change to their privacy laws. It's called the GDPR, I think the Global Protection Privacy Right or something like that. It's one of those acronyms you use all the time and forget what it stands for. So they've moved. The US hasn't, and because of its right to free speech, it probably will struggle. So in a sense on privacy, we're as much as anything following Europe. On merger laws being enhanced, I think everybody's going to move together. A lot of discussion about that. On unfair practices, as I say, we're already behind the rest of the world by a long way. But things like having an ombudsman, disinformation laws, having a bargaining code with the media, that is all brand new. And, well, pretty well, a minor exception in Europe and a bit So it gets a bit complicated, but they're largely things that we are trying to export to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is watching.
We have a question down the back.
Yeah, I'm Jamie Wilkinson from Canning's Purple. We're a strategic communications company. And Rod, my question relates to GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation.
Well, it's 3 out of 4 out of 10.
Yeah, that's pretty good. So that was introduced in Europe, and actually some organisations in Australia may fall under it as well if they've got European citizens or hold European citizens' data. There's no doubt it's given people in Europe more control of their data, but there have been some unintended consequences from a competitions perspective, which is some of the smaller businesses have just found it financially way too onerous. So what is the ACCC's view of Australia following a GDPR-style regulation?
Look, good question. We have recommended very much in concert with the people I share a building with at the Privacy Commissioner, variations on that, on the GDPR, but I think it's something we need to watch carefully. It has caused a couple of problems. One is, because it's onerous, it does benefit newer companies who've got great data systems for which read the platforms. It's also being used to not share data between the platforms and others who'd like to get hold of some of that data. And as you say, the smaller companies have suffered enormously because of the requirements of it, particularly, as I say, the older companies. So, yeah, many problems. I guess we feel on privacy, we've said, look, it's clear to us that the privacy laws we have in Australia are completely inappropriate because they're so principles-based to be unenforceable. And the whole idea of just informing people and letting them choose just doesn't work anymore. But what the laws need to be changed to, I think, is something that governments need to turn their minds at. We've made a few suggestions for changes, and we've suggested a code that the platforms have to give to the Privacy Commissioner, which will provide a lot more information on what data they're getting and what they're doing with it. But beyond exactly how Australia formulates its privacy laws is probably beyond our expertise. But you're right, there's definitely just blind adoption of GDPR is not a good idea.
Question.
Corrine Blenkinsop, Department of Primary Industries Regional Development. 2 questions. One in terms of capability building and critical analysis. It seems to me that at a whole range of different levels, we're all our own best protection, and I guess advice that if you're a consumer organisation, ACCC, state administrations,
Sorry, could you
there's
just
advice.
have the microphone just a little closer? Sorry.
There's advice that advice you can provide to consumers as to how to best arm themselves to be critically aware. So I guess a comment on what the ACCC's guide might be in terms of consumer awareness would be interesting. And secondly, would you like to comment on obviously in terms of these companies, they have different responsiveness depending on which governments they're dealing with, which regimes they're dealing with, and they seem to be very responsive in other jurisdictions to governments' concerns about privacy or national security and other sorts of things, and perhaps different in countries like Australia and Europe and America where we're talking about free speech and democracy. So would you like to comment on whether you might be able to understand from those companies how they respond to perhaps countries like China, where they have completely different regimes in place, or Saudi Arabia? There's all sorts of different regimes depending on which country you're in. We have a completely different experience of Facebook than you would if you're in China or Saudi Arabia, for example.
Yeah, look, I think if I understand, so I've got I'll ask the second question first and then I'll make sure I got the first one. I think, obviously, places like China are so completely different that they have to make massive changes and decide whether to be there or not. They've also got north of 1 billion people, so that sort of helps. But I would say their attitude to most other countries, certainly ones we compare ourselves to, has, and this is changing, I think, but my view is they've taken a, we're just not responsible view. We just provide a platform, we're just humble platform providers, and whatever happens on our platform, we'll blame the person who put it on the platform, blame the advertiser who took advantage of the data, blame Cambridge Analytica, and I personally think that's just completely untenable. They created the platform, they curate it, they guide the algorithms, they make a lot of money out of it. I think they've just got to take more responsibility. So I see a fairly uniformative view around the world in how they deal with governments. As I say, China's an exception, but I think they're going to have to change, and I think they recognise they're just going to have to take responsibility for what happens on their platform. In relation to your first question, I think it was about informing consumers about what's going on. I'd like to think the report has done that in some way. Cambridge Analytica was probably the main way that was done. That was a dreadful incident, but brought home to people the harms, I think. I mean, I think that really triggered a knowledge of what could be done with that amount of data if you wanted to do it. I think the other thing that we wanted, so I think people are more informed, but I think the way we would see information happening is require the digital platforms to explain to people exactly what data they're collecting and what they're doing with it. Now, as I say, that'll probably be some stuff that people won't read, but journalists will get hold of it, privacy advocates will get hold of it, and we will just all know because that information will be sent around. So I think it's absolutely crucial that that information is out there, and I think it's crucial that it's out there for other companies as well. There's a lot of companies doing things with data, many of which are fine, but if we want to take full advantage of the data economy, we have to take consumers with us. I think, there's been a big, I'm rabbiting on a bit, but there's been a big backlash against our recommendations on privacy from corporate Australia. I mean, they hate the idea that privacy laws would get improved. But I think they've just got to be careful that we don't start doing things and people are just so unaware of it because you'll get a backlash. You've got to, if what you're doing is fine, if what you're doing is providing more services to people, well, let them know what you're doing. I think that's something corporate Australia has not come to grips with yet. They're still fighting all of our privacy recommendations pretty well, and I don't think it's in their interest to do that.
On that topic, it's often said that there's an element, obviously, where people don't understand how the data is being used or what's being collected. But often when people are given the option, do I agree to the privacy policy or tick this box to participate in this site? And I think there's research that suggests people will say that they're worried about privacy, but when actually given a choice, they gladly give it away. So to what extent do you think that consumer backlash will occur as people learn more? Or do you think it will change behaviour as people are confronted with this choice? If I go forward, I know how my data is going to be used.
I think that people just are so, firstly, they're ill-informed. They just don't know what it is they're agreeing to. Secondly, these are must-use platforms, so it's not as if you're hovering over the choice. And thirdly, how do you know what you're agreeing to? The privacy policies, one academic rather humorously compared the privacy platforms of the digital platforms with food manufacturers and said, well, it's like your food labelling being, look, we may want to put sugar in your product or we may not. We may decide how much sugar to put in. We may change the amount of sugar at any point in time. And I can't do it as well as she did it. It was really a clever thing. But the privacy, so I just don't think people ticking the box is any indication at all of preferences. And I think the more we get the Cambridge Analyticas and other things, we took Health Engine to court for selling people's health data to insurance companies, and that caused a flood of phone calls to Talkback Radio. So I think people do care, and our survey certainly showed that.
Down here.
Galen Cooney from Ashurst. I'm just wondering, with the awareness that you say about Cambridge Analytica and your report, are there any alternatives to Google now that are actually doing the right thing? Are there any good companies?
Well, look, first of all, DuckDuckGo. The head of there's two joint heads of our platform team, and one of them, I don't know what the other one's on, but this one I was travelling with recently, and we were going from A to B and she was using the location device on DuckDuckGo. She said it's not quite as good, but it's pretty good. And they have a very different approach to privacy. Look, it's not so much a matter of right thing and wrong thing, I guess. It's just letting people know. So, but yes, I think there are there's definitely companies who have different approaches to privacy. Just as you see, Apple is a very different company to Google. Apple makes money out of not using your data so much. It's not a data company. It monetizes by selling you these wonderful little contraptions you've all got, which of course become obsolete in about 2 years. So that's their business model. So yes, there's other companies out there who can provide the services with a completely different business model.
Over here.
Justin, thank you. My name is Gary Gray. I'm a former federal MP. Justin, I'm interested by your background, having been an ACCC employee, and now you're representing business against the ACCC. How do you personally look at the agenda which has been established here on privacy, the economic benefits to our nation and the personal benefits that derive to every individual, none of whom is sufficiently organised to say to you, Justin, there's an obligation on you to not monetise your knowledge of this system and for you to act in the interests of the people also. The ACCC in this process and legislators going through their process will be subject to intense efforts from lobbyists. Where will you sit in that context?
This is great. Ask him more questions. Go for it.
Boldly defending our clients is the direct answer. I mean, I think it's an interesting... The current environment that we're in is interesting because these platforms, if you take a longer view, are not that old. There were previously platforms that were successful that came and went, and these new platforms has replaced them. And there'll certainly be a view that there's other platforms coming, people's behaviour changes, consumer tastes change. So I think that while you can recognise the issues identified in the digital inquiry, I'm not sure that from my perspective I'm persuaded that it's all bad. And I think one of the factors in doing this kind of inquiry, you're necessarily looking at the dark corners where people have an incentive and ability to do something wrong, and then you investigate to determine whether they have done something wrong. And the law, the regulator's job is to find those people and take action, but not every case that you see is necessarily an abuse of market power or some illegal conduct. And I think there's a conversation going on at the moment between these platforms, governments and society about how much do they value their data, what do they want it to use. To the extent that you regulate it, it will affect innovation. We talked about the GDPR earlier. It's got consequences, and one of the issues with all regulation is the unintended consequences. So I think while it's important to look at these things and try and develop a solution, I don't think that anybody is at the point where you can say clearly all of these people are, out to do the wrong thing, and I'm not sure that's necessarily the suggestion. The question is just how do you design a system that works. Does that answer your question? Yeah, sure.
I think it's...
Yes, down here.
Mine is, how do we deal with the clash that's coming between the regulatory regimes of trying to protect privacy, and at the same time what we're doing is we're asking our digital platforms to tell us about the content, then protect the content that's in the platform. I would liken it in an analogue system of saying...
Sorry, can you put the microphone again close? Sorry.
In an analogue system, it was like saying to Australia Post, we want you to open the envelopes and tell us there's no dangerous content within the letters. So when you design a tech platform, you actually have to design it to know what the content of that platform is. You have to actually make that design give you the information or not. So by making our digital platforms be responsible for content, you're also telling them to get more data from the users of those platforms. So both those sides of regulation, of saying you're responsible for what's in your platform, is a direct clash to saying don't use consumers' private data for reasons that they don't understand. So how do you deal with that clash?
Look, partly the answer to that is, and partly also picking up on what Justin said, I mean, the headline question is, do governments want to get involved here, or do they just want to leave it to the digital platforms? And the digital platforms were very clear that they did not want to take any responsibility for these issues. Now, my view is, even if they did, there's a role for government, but the answer is they didn't. And, you know, Cambridge Analytica, to me, the reaction of Facebook was nothing to do with us. They weren't out there, let the whole thing run. There was no comment from Facebook. So to me, the headline question is does government get ahead of these issues? I accept how you do it is tricky, but I guess, you know, the Christchurch atrocity, we've got laws that sought to at least think about prosecuting the TV stations that showed a fraction of the Christchurch footage, because there's laws against them doing that, but there was no law against what the platforms did, which had the whole thing. Now, of course, it's difficult to move quickly to take them down. I accept that. But the question is, do you have some regulation? Do you try? Well, I personally think particularly having understood the ad tech, the digital platforms can do so much more than they're doing now to deal with deliberate disinformation, misinformation, Christchurch tragedies, and that's not getting involved in personal information. That's, you know, that's clearly a scam. I'm absolutely totally aware of scams that are so obviously scams and that are costing people a lot of money that one digital platform has known about for a long time and did absolutely nothing about it. And the reaction I got being involved in that is I just didn't care. Now, I know that's a harsh thing to say, but that is my honest opinion out of that one incident. So I just think government has got to get them to accept some responsibility. How far you go, it's a tricky issue. So all we've recommended, just to finish on this, is we've recommended that the platforms put in place, when there's disinformation, misinformation, I mean deliberate falsehoods designed for bad ends, unambiguously bad, that they have processes to take those things down. We're not saying the government's going to tell them what to take down. We're not arguing that. We're saying you have a process to take that down. You have a process that you have internally to go through to decide whether to take that down, which they don't have much at the moment. So it's pretty mild stuff. We're sort of here at zero regulation, and we're just moving to here. Where we are on that journey, where we'll get to, I don't know, but we've got to start. And that many of our recommendations are making a start.
Do you think so I know that you said that it's a mild regulation and you're starting down the end, but do you know to what extent should people be concerned about the growth if there's a unit in government that's job is to look at things online and say, well, that's definitely illegal and everyone can agree about that, but then it sort of slowly, I think, organisations necessarily expand over time. Do you think that's a genuine concern?
Oh, look, I think we're so far over here. I'm way from worrying about where we might get to. And look, let's understand, and we've got all sorts of laws in this country which people can agree with or disagree with. I mean, Northern Territory doesn't care how fast you go down the highway. There's no speed limits, at least last time I looked there wasn't, but most other states have got speed limits on the cars. There's very clear rules about what you can show on television, what ads can occur, how long the ads are, how many ads you can have. Certain ads can't be shown within certain hours because you're worried children will see them. Certain ads just can't be shown at all. You've got to label certain ads. You may think you're informing people, but someone's going to say it's political advertising. You can't have political advertising 3 days out from an election. I mean, I'm just dealing with television. So we've got rules all the time, and we've got massive rules governing our banking sector, massive rules governing our energy sector, which I think you could easily spend half an hour and say a number of those could easily disappear. So we're so far away from over-regulating the platforms that worrying about that, I think, is just starting in the wrong place.
Changing topic slightly, just to talk about the relationship between platforms and the media. You said earlier in your discussion that platforms are in the business of building traffic, and one of the ways they do that is by republishing articles from traditional media sites, and traditional media sites are therefore finding it harder to monetize. But nonetheless, platforms themselves rely on the existence of traditional media in order to do that. How do you think that is playing out? I know there's a bargaining code of conduct, but if it was left unchecked and media ultimately withered on the vine, wouldn't the platforms go with it? Would it sort of self-correct, or do you think there's something else that will mean it won't?
Look, I mean, so your question is, would the media companies start becoming publishers and create their own content to take the place of the media? Look, I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a bit of a risk. I mean, the media play a fundamental role. They're called the Fourth Estate. They're a fundamental part of our society and our democracy. It's the way we get news. The good news with the internet is we've got some new media companies that we didn't have before. I mean, Australia traditionally has had basically two main newspapers, and mainly newspapers are the ones that generate most of the news. We've got 5 television stations and a range of radio stations, but it's the newspapers that are core, and we've had 2 historically. Now you've got Guardian Australia, you've got BuzzFeed, you've got a whole range of them, which I'll muck it up if I try. So they've got a lot of them, but they're struggling as well. I mean, they are absolutely struggling. So you've got many more, and look, one thing I like to point out is the ABC. Traditionally, when I was growing up, it was a TV you got your TV and you got your radio. Now it's a publisher, right? I mean, a good number of people get their news online. If you get your news online, you can go to smh.com.au, you can go to news.com.au, or you can go to the ABC. Most of the ABC stories are there in print so we've got that as well. In Western Australia, yes, you've got a couple of newspapers, but you've got Fairfax online. I can't remember what it's called now, but they've got a small bureau here. So the internet has improved the diversity of news, but they're struggling. And I think we lose a lot as a society if we don't have a vibrant newspaper industry. And I think relying on it coming from the digital platforms where there's such a propensity to misinformation and disinformation. I mean, whatever you think of the news publishers, they come from a culture of professional journalism. That's sort of what they do. Just like mining companies usually have a culture of, certainly some of them, of professional geology. I mean, there's a core to what they are. I don't think this is core to what Facebook and Google are. I think if we lose the media, we as a society have lost quite a lot.
And so fundamentally, do you think the issue then is really about the revenue that the platforms earn, giving media access to that in some way?
Oh no, the bargaining code is there to allow bargaining, and as I say, I found that Robert Thompson, who's the worldwide chief executive of News Limited article, I think it's on page 19 of the Oz, I found it quite interesting because he's saying he thinks the corner's been a bit turned by the things that the platforms are now offering newspapers. So, it can be access to data, it can be how you list news content, it can be not discriminating against paywalls. There's a whole range of things that I think could make a big difference. Usually when organisations say, look, the world's terrible, we want this much, if they sort of get this much, they can turn out to be pretty happy. I think this can work out pretty well.
Sure. Now, one of the recommendations related to the new rule against unfair practices, which you described as something that Australia is lagging behind the rest of the world. Is there anything about digital platforms that sort of made that issue stark and sort of promote? Because it's obviously not an issue limited only to digital platforms.
No, that's right. It's been an issue around for some time, but and look, with all the just as a quick side point, I mean, there's a lot of discussion in banking about how do we get banks to treat their customers fairly, and we've got an enormous array of regulation, which seems to me personally a bit excessive. Well, if what you're trying to do is get the banks to behave fairly, why don't you just have a law against unfair practices? That might get rid of a whole host of other laws. But anyway, on digital platforms, yes, things like the scams I mentioned, where people were seriously losing money by this scam that wasn't taken down. Serious harm. No other law can get at that besides unfair practices. If your data is used in such a way that it causes you great harm, that could be unfair. Even having bundled agreements where to use the platform, you've got to agree to all this, could be seen as unfair. So it did come through very, very largely. It brought it home. It was an issue. Unfairness has been around as a debate within the ACCC for a long time because we're the outlier that doesn't have it, and we sort of thought, do our laws sort of get there? And we were thinking about the issue. With digital platforms, we've now formed a clear view that it's needed.
And there.
David Harrison, Murdoch University. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My question is, what is the role of consumers in this conversation? So, Rod, yourself and the ACCC are out there shining a torch on these issues, but is there a role or an obligation for consumers to be demanding better or different to get the change that's required? Or do you sort of feel as though you're out the front and you look behind you and maybe there's no one there?
Oh, look, that's one of the great philosophical questions of our time, really, the role of consumers. I just read in The Australian, again earlier this week, I read 3 newspapers a day, so I don't think the fact that I've mentioned The Australian twice is biased, but someone was saying, well, consumers are paying a stupid tax because they can easily shop around for low-priced mortgages and they're too silly to do it. I'm sort of paraphrasing the article a bit. So energy, people were, 20 to 25% of small businesses were on the so-called standing offers for energy and paying easily 30% more than they needed to, which they could, a phone call to their supplier would have got them a lower price. So this issue of what responsibility of consumers versus the companies is, I think, a tricky one, a philosophical one. Different people will have different views. But with energy, there's no doubt in my mind the energy companies were trying to deliberately confuse the customers. I think there's a little bit of that going on in banking. Here, I think the consumers just aren't informed. I think the privacy policies are not meant to inform you. They're meant to say, I got this data and you agreed. They're a consent to getting your data policy. So I think, yes, of course, in a market economy, consumers have got a role to choose, but I think that here they're just so ill-informed, that's not the problem. I should just say one other thing. I get all these, I know I'm going off track here, but I get all these lovely letters about petrol pricing, and I always love my petrol stories. So someone said to me once, he wrote to me this long, heartfelt letter, and they were driving around Geelong, as it happens, and they went into one petrol station, and the petrol station was charging $1.50 for petrol, and they said, this is outrageous. They went 50 metres down the road and bought the petrol for $1.20, 30 cents cheaper. But he took the time to write to me to say, what the hell are you doing about the person charging $1.50? They're ripping off consumers. What are you doing about it? So different consumers have different views about how much they should exercise choice. It is a fascinating question, but here I don't think it arises. I think they just don't have the information to make those choices.
So, on the question of mergers, particularly whenever the competition regulator indicates that they'd like to reform mergers further,
Got to be a bad thing. Right?
It focuses the mind for corporate Australia. Do you mind talking through the thinking and about the proposed changes to Section 50?
Yeah, our Section 50 merger law just says don't have a merger if it's likely to have the effect of substantially lessening competition. It's then got some factors to take into account. We're saying some of those, but 2 extra factors should be acquisition of data through any merger, and secondly, whether you're removing what could be a potential competitor. Now, as you say, the business community is apoplectic about this for exactly that logic. If we want it, it's obviously got to be something they don't want. I mean, this is really clear. And, you know, the Business Council's response to our report is just about no, 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 no. But the issue we have is just signalling to the courts that these things are allowable. And I think the whole notion of potential competitors is going to take off worldwide. And if we don't adopt that, we'll be the outlier. I have no doubt about that. Having spoken to overseas competition regulators, they will do that and go further. So that's what we're suggesting is quite a modest change. And it really is a signal to the courts as distinct from a massive upending of our merger laws.
So if I were a small outfit with a new piece of technology and my dreams of one day getting bought out by Google or Facebook, should I abandon those dreams, or do you think it's still possible?
Oh no, look, that's, seriously, if I can put it that way, that's one of the great misinformed comments. The law says don't have an acquisition, or don't have an acquisition if it substantially lessens, likely to substantially lessen competition. If the purchase that buys out your business is going to substantially lessen competition, it should not happen. I mean, there's just no doubt about that. How often is this going to happen? A few % of the time. That's all we're talking about. So it doesn't. I mean, people, of course, they want to get bought out. That's fine. 98, 99% of the time, that's fine. But occasionally it amounts to a substantial lessening of competition. And think of the reverse. Do we want every fintech to be bought out by the big 4 banks? Is that what we want? Well, of course we don't. Do we want every tech company to be bought out by Facebook and Google? Well, of course not. That's absurd. We're just trying to make sure that those ones where there could be an impact on competition are caught. Just trying to make the merger laws effective. We can talk about Willie Rioli and whether he should get 1 year or 4 years. That's the dominant conversation I've had over the last couple of days.
The digital inquiry report is interesting. Well, it stands out. One of the reasons why it stands out, and something we were discussing earlier, is the fact that you had very broad terms of reference and therefore were conducting a wide-ranging inquiry. Do you think that this is now a template for overseas overseas regulators and governments to look at things in the same way, or do you think that the piece of work that you've done now probably outlines the nature of the problem and the focus should really be on enforcement and identifying what the rules of the road should be?
Well, look, you're right. As we discussed at the table, the reason why our report was different to others is that, I mean, the European Commission has taken enforcement action against the platforms. We haven't done that here, so in many ways they're ahead of us. But their enforcement action has been against particular breaches of the law, preferencing Google Shopping, for example, by Google. Ours was not an investigation, it was an inquiry with very broad terms of reference. So in 650 pages, we've set a whole range of things out that people around the world just didn't know about. So that's been the value of the inquiry. It has informed a lot of people about how things are going on, and therefore is informing debates overseas. And it is influencing debates in certain ways. But I think the real lesson out of it is that monitoring work about what's going on has got to keep continuing. Yes, we've got so far, but there's so much more to learn. And for one example is we're recommending we have a decent look at the ad tech system to work out where the money goes. A lot of companies have done experiments. They bought $100 worth of ads on their own platform and worked out how much of the ad what ad that bought, and in one case it was 30 cents in the dollar. What happened to the other 70 cents? But also, is there self-preferencing? I mean, so there's a lot of extra things we need to work on, and we'll be doing that.
Next question, Danny.
Galen Cooney again. You call them tech platforms, and I think a lot of people do, but I think at some stages you're also questioning whether they're publishers, and some of them seem to be curating the news feeds that we're receiving. Is there I suppose, a way of just considering that they are publishers and just regulating them like a TV station or a newspaper or, an advertiser, and just they are mainstream media? They don't get a special set of rules.
Oh, look, them's interesting words, let me say. So one of our recommendations was align the regulatory framework between platforms and, I guess, media companies. The television stations think this is a great idea because they're regulated to an inch of their lives and the digital platforms aren't, so they want to equalise the playing field. The newspapers hate the idea because they're not regulated at all. So, apart from things like defamation and a bit of an interest in copyright law, but in terms of what ads you can show and all sorts of other things like that. So it's a complicated topic. In terms of are they publishers, I think they do curate what you see. They are actively altering those algorithms that determine what you do see in your feed. Obviously everybody gets onto Google and the first number of things you see are all paid ads, and so that's obviously curated, but Facebook will curate things to influence what you see. So they're absolutely doing that, but they're not sourcing much of their own content. So look, I think they're part publishers, part not. I think rather than, I guess, engage in trying to work out the label, let's just work out what we think the issues are and what should be the solutions, right? So we sort of call them part publishers, but we didn't wrestle with it beyond that because we thought it doesn't really get you anywhere.
A question over here.
Hello, Julia Powers from the University of Western Australia. One of the challenges with the privacy paradigm is that it really puts a lot of the focus on individuals. And I'm just interested in the course of your inquiry, whether you looked much at group privacy, sort of collective asset management, and in particular, I think a real opportunity for Australia to lead in the sphere of Indigenous data governance.
Look, we didn't much. That's areas beyond which we did look, and so but I think it's part of, I guess, what we're saying, that data issues are still in their infancy, and a whole lot of organisations these days, including the ACCC, are thinking very hard about data governance. So I think it's just part of the issues that are being unearthed. But seriously, I'm sorry, I don't have much more to say on it.
The ACCC taking on data, you've got an expanding role in energy, you've got the traditional areas. It seems like a very large task for the organisation, and appreciate that there are other agencies involved. But I mean, how is the ACCC facing that? Do you have the resources in order to take on these areas? Do you see the agency evolving in different ways in order to continue to work effectively?
Well, look, the ACCC has grown a fair bit because we've been given new things to do, and the problem we've got is the sort of core work is not being well resourced. So we do need more resources to do what it is we do, which is deal with mergers, deal with Jakarta airbags, deal with consumer and competition enforcement. So that is an issue. But to be fair to the government, each time they've given us a new task, they've given us the incremental resources to deal with that. It'd be nice to get some resources to deal with the core business. Look, I think the data economy is something that competition and consumer regulators need expertise in, and so having the unit on a continuing basis will give us that expertise. We've now got continuing units involved in electricity, gas, agriculture, and financial services. And look, I think that gives us expertise and broadens our reach and allows us to be more effective in competition and consumer matters in those areas. So, I'm sort of hoping we don't get too many more inquiries wandering down the road at us, but in those areas I mentioned, agriculture, finance, electricity, gas, digital platforms, we are we're almost there as permanent players now. So that's no longer new. That's now caked in business as usual, what we do.
Down here.
Hi there, my name's Neil Burgess. I'm from the WA Department of the Premier and the Cabinet. I just wanted to
I'll
ask...
get you to hold the microphone.
Sorry. Sainsburyland to me. A lot of your recommendations were related to the Privacy Act and amendments to that. Just had a question whether you thought it was the case that the Privacy Act could be, brought up to what your expectations were through amendments, or whether you thought that it needed a more wholesale refresh, structural changes.
Yeah, look, 4 of our recommendations of the 23 were privacy, just to put that into perspective. And we basically recommended 3 things. One was have a particular code that just deals with the platforms to deal with issues there, particularly around what data are they collecting, what are they doing with it. Secondly, make some immediate changes to the privacy laws that particularly better define what's personal information and better dealing with consent and things like that. And then thirdly, we said, look, have a review of the privacy laws, longer term review. So make some changes now and have a fuller review, which, we would participate in, but we're not in any way the major player there. I mean, we worked very closely with the Privacy Commissioner. We realised we didn't understand their world. So we had a lot of meetings, and pretty much what we've recommended is at least 95% agreed with the Privacy Commissioner. But yes, one of the recommendations is a fuller review of the Privacy Act.
Do you see agencies like the Privacy Commissioner sort of changing their style as a result of you working together, or vice versa?
Oh, I think they need, and the government announced just prior to the election actually that their penalties would go up from being negligible to being serious. They'll get more resources, and if they get an act that's a little clearer and not so principles based it's unenforceable, I think you'll see them taking enforcement action. And of course, to be clear, unless you're on the receiving end of that enforcement action, that's what everybody wants. I mean, unless you're enforcing the law's not there. There's no point having laws if they're not enforced, and occasionally you do need to take people to court to enforce those laws, to send the message that these laws matter. So I think they'll start doing that.
I think we have time for one last question. Is anybody willing to pop their hand up? No? Please, Paula.
You were driven into that, weren't you, Paula? That's very unfair of Justin.
I suppose my question was, after concluding the inquiry, what surprised you? Was there anything, or were there a number of things that really kind of alarmed you from your inquiry?
Oh, it was the data question, no doubt. Just the amount of data, the speed with which that data is assembled, and what can be done with that data. And when I say what can be done with it, way beyond what the platforms might intend to be done with it. But if you've got that much information about people, where does that take you? And there's been some wonderful documentaries and TED Talks, which I've seen on what was done with the Cambridge Analytica data. I don't know, I can't swear that they're 100% accurate, but if there's the potential for that sort of profiling, where you can profile someone who may be very interested, and this particular TED Talk I saw was on Brexit, who are the sort of 10% of the population who are wavering on the question, what matters to them? And this TED Talk alleged that with the knowledge they had of those people, they deliberately fed them false information that they knew would change their vote. Now, as I say, I was listening to it, but it seemed pretty credible. It was a Guardian journalist who had a very Welsh name that I can never remember, but a really good talk. And it's just the potential for that sort of thing, which I guess surprised me and somewhat alarmed me.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I think that's an exciting, foreboding note to end on. And we'll wrap it up there.
Thank you. Thanks very much.